I don't want that. Okay, let's begin. Let me have your attention. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker. But before I introduce today's speaker, I need to make a comment or two about the presentation today. As most of you know, at least once per semester, sometimes twice each semester, we will have a presentation that is so-called out of the box, to cause us to think outside of the box, and even outside of the nuclear box. And today's presentation is in that arena, and we're indeed privileged to have with us Dr. Frank Harris, who is currently the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research here at UT. He was previously with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He's had an impressive career. Let me just give you a few of the essentials. He received a BA degree from Wabash College in 1964, and then an MS and PhD from the University of Tennessee in botany in 1966 and 70, respectively. And from 1970 to 80, he was at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the field of terrestrial ecology. He became group leader in that particular group. And then he left Oak Ridge in 1980 and went to D.C. and was with the National Science Foundation from 1980 to 1993. And I guess he missed his roots, so in 1993 he returned to East Tennessee, came back to the University of Tennessee in 93, and was the first director of the Division of Biology, which are all of the biological programs here at the university. And he held that position until the year 2000. And then in the year 2000, he went back to Oak Ridge as Associate Laboratory Director, which is one of the number 2 positions. He was in that position. His directorate was Biology and the Environment. He held that position from 2000 to 2004, and then he came back to the University of Tennessee. So he's an Oak Ridger, and he's a UT person. And we are indeed privileged to have him with us today to tell us about a very interesting subject that is non-nuclear. The title of his presentation is Smoky Mountains Discovery Center. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Frank Harris.
Lee, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to you for taking some time out of your day to hear this little story. I got to thinking about, I'm talking to a nuclear engineering group, and this is not nuclear engineering. This is about biology and about some other things, the preservation, if you will, of a very special environment. But there is a tie to nuclear engineering, because if we had more nuclear energy, we'd have a cleaner environment over the top of the Smokies. And our problems in some respects would be a lot less. So I am a proponent of nuclear energy, and I think we missed the boat about 20 years ago, and hopefully some of you guys in your careers can help us make that up. The other thing, and I like, Lee, the idea of bringing in some outside kinds of activities to show students that you may be trained in one thing, and this is a little bit of a busman's holiday for me because I am a biologist, but yet, as you'll see, the dimensions that I'm talking about are much broader. But the first question I was asked at my PhD oral was, what books have you read outside of your field? And I kind of went, I hadn't. And this was Henry Freeberg, who's now retired from Ag Plant and Soil Science on the Ag campus. And Henry said, well, that's bad, because as a PhD, or even at the baccalaureate level, you need to be a continuing learner and not draw the line at your particular field, but reach beyond that. So in this area, I'm beginning to learn economics and how to interact with the local elected officials, et cetera. But what I want to talk about today is a project that's sort of, you know, for those of us in the area, when we think of the Smoky Mountains, and you go over into Sevier County, there's a tremendous love for that landscape. And people take great pride in recounting their lineage back in there, clear back into the before there was European settlement. A lot of interest in the Smokies, a lot of interest in the health and well-being of the Smokies. And part of it is because of a land ethic, and part of it is because that is a very important engine of economic wealth over there in Pigeon Forge and Dollywood and so forth. Say what you will, 10 million visitors a year come into this area because of the attractions that are over there. And in some respects, they're loving the park to death with transportation pressures, et cetera, et cetera. So this little activity began, and what I want to do today is introduce to you a concept and try and show you how we're trying to bring that to reality. You may come away and say, well, this is a total dream, but over the course of the presentation, I'm going to try and bring that rather clouded schematic of a landscape architect's rendition of what this park might look like and show you how it came to be. We go back to about the year 2000, this little Great Smoky Mountains Discover Life Center, and what we're about is trying to develop a venue that will promote the popular understanding and discovery and appreciation of the diversity of natural life in the Smokies. Now, we're in a high tourism area, so we've got to compete with all the glitz and the computer age and so forth and so on. So this has to be an exciting adventure. It has to be entertaining, but I think we can also combine an educational experience with that, what I call an edutainment venue. Ripley's Aquarium is an edutainment venue. If you go over there, on the one hand, you're entertained, but if you look at those exhibits, last year they had the Titanic, this year they have the Abyss, and all the interesting specialized biology that occurs in those high-pressure, cold-temperature environments. You can't help but learn anything. So here's Joe Sixpack spending discretionary time with their family, discretionary income in this kind of an environment, and they go away with an appreciation of something they may not have appreciated before. So this center that we're talking about, we are looking at it as a nonprofit kind of an activity. Why nonprofit? Why not get some big corporate backer in there like Ripley's? Well, as good as Ripley's may have done with the aquarium, you would like to remain nonprofit because that way you control your agenda. So we want this to be pure to the environment that we're trying to protect. We don't want to symbolize the hillbillies and have mock-ups of stills and this, that, and the other. We want it to focus on the natural heritage of the Smokies. It's got to be something that combines aspects of a museum and a botanical garden and a zoo interspersed with things that are pretty high-tech. We want it to also reflect the fact that there's a tremendous amount of science in the region and that this facility itself could become a renowned scientific activity in its own right. So that ultimately, in its full dimensions, we show the broad range, the full range of the Southern Appalachian biodiversity. And I apologize to folks that might be looking at this on webcast. I didn't realize that the fonts wouldn't show up as well. And I would apologize to the audience because this is a presentation that was developed initially to sell the local governments and the local business community in Sevier County on what we're trying to do. And it's since been morphed, and it'll continue to be morphed as the project evolves. The project inception goes back even a little earlier than the year 2000, but in 2000, three things came together. First of all, and if you're in from the Knoxville area, you probably have seen in the Knoxville News Sentinel over time, a number of articles about this bunch of crazy biologists that are trying to inventory all the living life in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We've been to the moon, we've been to the bottom of the ocean, but nowhere on the face of the earth have we ever fully cataloged the full diversity of the organisms that live there. And why is this important? Well, okay, scientifically it's interesting. It's not necessarily the human genome type project, but it is interesting from an evolutionary biology standpoint and from ecological standpoints. Why would the park be interested in something like this? The park is charged with maintaining and managing that landscape in perpetuity for the benefit of U.S. citizens. And increasingly, their management objectives are conflicted by organisms that are alien to the environment. How do they know they have a problem if they don't know what's there originally until they see something like the woolly adelgid that took out the spruce fir, or the hemlock woolly adelgid that's now ravaging the hemlocks, sudden death disease in oaks, and I could go on and on. There are just a number of invasive species that the park has to be concerned about, but they need to be concerned about them before they become a problem. And the way you do that is with good inventory data. The second thing that really feeds into this concept is a place called the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. It's a museum that started in the 50s by a small group of fairly well-to-do folks in the Tucson area who wanted basically an outdoor museum typifying that particular Sonoran Desert habitat. If you've ever been there, it's a museum that is absolutely integrated into the landscape that it's a part of. And so there are a lot of outdoor exhibits, but there are also a lot of things in a main museum building and so forth. And we said, well, okay, if we're going to model after something, let's look at the Sonoran Desert Museum concept. So thus far, we're talking about some conservation-oriented folks and some scientists that have kind of gotten together and they have this good idea, okay? The thing that really began to bring it to fruition, and this is where I'm on a learning curve and you would be as a technically trained engineer moving into this environment, is interacting with the public, interacting with businessmen, interacting with local governments. And at a conference in 2000, there's a group of folks in Gatlinburg that would like to see Gatlinburg move in some different directions. You know, enough of the T-shirt parlor and tattoo shop, etc. Let's see if there's some other things that you could do to make Gatlinburg a more upscale, if you will, destination. Elitist perhaps, but that is the view. There is also a view of focusing on development in Gatlinburg that preserves that boundary, if you will, with the national park. And it's the Gatlinburg Gateway Foundation. And they had a conference in 2000, and one of the outcomes of that was a group got started to look at, well, how do we take advantage of all this good science that's coming out of the ATBI and parlay that into something that would be of interest to the public? And so that's what we've been working on since. Now, as I said, the objective of the all-species inventory is to really try and inventory all of the living life in the Smokies, including, we'll probably never get there totally, bacteria. I won't say viruses, but at least bacteria. And, you know, we can estimate that perhaps there's something like 100,000 species in the park, of which we really only know now about 10,000. This is circa 1998. In the intervening time, as of September, the scientists working on very limited funds and you know, their own time during the summers and so forth, they have identified 516 species of organisms that had never before been described by science, and about 3,300 plus species that had never been recorded in the park. Now, these are not the warm, furry, charismatic organisms like mammals and birds and so forth. Those are well worked out. But those mammals and birds eat small organisms, insects, algae, etc. And this is where the unknowns are. So typically the way they work, and I hesitate to say this because it falls right into the stereotype that many of us have about natural scientists, but for example, Dollywood gave us some money to have a butterfly or a Lepidoptera blitz. You know, the butterfly is one of Dolly's little icons for her theme park. So it's very logical that we tap that source for some support there. What does a butterfly blitz involve? Well, you invite all of the experts around the country and even internationally to come to Gatlinburg for a 72-hour period where you basically blitz the park. So the idea of running through the woods with the nets, okay, that's one way to view it. But they set up their sampling stations and collect the LEPs. And then they sit around, and you've got experts in different areas, and they say, oh, here's a such and so. And everybody will run over and look at that, and the students are there, and it's quite a learning experience, but it's also out of that they say, hey, this is one we've never seen before. And then they begin the hard work of actually identifying a species. Like this little red salamander. The Smokies are notorious for their salamander fauna, just simply because of the diversity of geology and substrates and so forth that have allowed speciation to occur. So at the conclusion of this ATBI, and we've sort of set a 10-year time frame, we're going to know more about the Smokies biota, flora and fauna, than any other place on Earth. And what we've tried to do then is, if you're going to, this is a scientific enterprise, how do you then fund it? How do you translate that into educational programs and so forth? And so another little organization was started as kind of the umbrella for this activity called Discover Life. Basically, Discover Life in America is the fundraising umbrella for this species activity. The interesting thing about Discover Life in America is that we now have several national parks have come to the Smokies and asked, how did you do this? How did you get this started? We'd like to do the same thing for Point Reyes National Seashore, for Acadia National Forest, for the Everglades, for Yellowstone, for Rocky Mountain. Major parks are looking at what we've done in the Smokies as an example of what they can do and should do, again, for the management purposes in their own park. So the Discover Life Center connection to all this is that we need money. And we would argue that the Discover Life Center, properly set up and operated as a business, could provide funds that could then, in perpetuity, through a foundation, fund natural history type research in the park. Now, that's not an original idea. Dollywood operates two foundations out of her operation. Challenger, which we've seen here in Neyland Stadium, her raptor rehabilitation. Raptors are hawks and eagles and so forth. That center is funded out of her business. Her Imagination Foundation, where every child ages birth through 6 years of age in Sevier County and now in other places where she has business enterprises, receive a book on their birthday. That's funded out of a foundation set up inside Dollywood's business plan to fund that kind of activity. So it's not original, but you get a certain amount of gray hair and you lose a certain amount of hair, and you don't have that many more original ideas. You go after ideas that are already there and try and apply them to your situation. Discover Life in America, that's why Lee Dodd is so smart. Discover Life in America is going to stay focused, the ATBI, on the Smokies. But the concept itself is probably franchisable. We can move that around the country, as I just explained. But the center we're talking about would be dedicated to the Smokies and to what's going on in the Smokies. And I saw some heads nod about this Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, but it really is something that blends into the landscape and is quite magnificent at practically any season of the year. It's probably more enjoyable in the spring and the fall. We were there in the summer, but even then in the morning, it was quite terrible. if you go there, they have, animal habitats that you can almost walk through. They have botanical gardens. They have various kinds of museums and docents that explain life in that very harsh desert environment. They have animal enclosures that you walk right up. There's almost an invisible fence. There's technology now that allows you to build barriers that the animals will stay behind, but you can still view them as if they're, you don't see the bars of cages and so forth. Now out there, they even have a little javelina, the little desert pig, a little guy about as big as a potbelly pig, that are wild animals that pretty much forage at will. Now, I don't know whether we could have possums roaming around this thing that we're doing in the Smokies or not, but you get the idea that this is a venue that is really integrating people with their environment. So the message we brought back was that we could do this in the Smokies, and we should. Now, I've mentioned the Gatlinburg Gateway Foundation. It's really the facilitation agent. The people that are involved here are, like Jeff Walpart is the president. Jeff is the owner of the Peddler Restaurant and the Park Grill. Obviously someone that's a successful business person with a vested interest in the park, but also with an interest in seeing the area develop in different ways. And they've been very helpful. They've helped us open doors with other federal or other government agencies, local government agencies. They've also helped us with some initial funding to bring some consultants in. So, none of this moves very fast, and I'm not going to reiterate because I've talked a lot about what we've done, but in the past 4 years, a lot of back and forth and talking, and one thing that you have to get used to, and it's maybe not unlike the faculty senate, but you'll have a meeting and you'll spend, I shouldn't talk bad about faculty senate.
Go ahead.
You'll have a meeting and you'll spend 90% of the time going over stuff that you've had in the last meeting and maybe 10% of new stuff. Well, that's in spades when you're dealing with lay people who aren't not technical or whatever. They've got other, our steering committee has an artist and an author and an architect and lots of different types of people. So people are brought along very slowly. So it's an exercise in patience in terms of developing and working with these kind of groups. Less so than with our own fellow professionals where we can, butt heads and we'll go away and come back and butt heads some more, and that's just kind of the way of life. With these groups, people's feelings are a lot more fragile and sensitive and so forth. But we came down to December of 2003, we attracted a grant from the Economic Development Agency. And that grant required that we raise $40,000. And so we had sold the concept to the point where we could go to Sevier County, Sevierville, Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg City Council, etc., and make up an amount of up to $40,000, which we did. And that allowed us then to bring in basically an early first-stage viability feasibility study. And where we are now, the team is made up of the former director of the Sonoran Desert Museum, Rick Daly, Jones & Jones, which is one of the leading landscape architects in the country for developing these sorts of landscape venues, and then a group called Economic Research Associates. It's kind of generic, but anyhow, they had done a lot of work with Sevier County already, so that we think we had a pretty good team. What we asked them to do, we're all starry-eyed now. This thing is the greatest thing since sliced bread. We haven't got a clue of the problems that face us in terms of fundraising and acquiring land and so forth and so on. And so you have to bring in experts and consultants that can bring you back to reality. And we asked, this group has done that. And some folks have already stepped forward and said, we have some land that we'll make available for a venue like this. And then they can begin to make some early analysis of economic viability. And one of the conditions of our grant, I don't know whether it's particular to this particular administration or more general, But a condition of our grant was that we seek and involve faith-based groups in our planning. And it's actually turned out to be kind of interesting, but also very helpful, because if you think about the customers that would come to a venue like this, it's going to be kind of your standard family, the 2 parents, 2.5 kids, et cetera. Where do you find those people most often? You find them in church congregations. And so we've gone around to lots of congregations. I was at the Unitarian Church late last month. I've been to Primitive Baptist Church over in Pittman Center. I have slides, will travel is what it amounts to. But what you're doing is trying to talk and introduce the concept, and at the same time ask for, well, how do we make this relevant to your particular interest? And we now have a report, and it's a good report, but it doesn't have quite the it has a lot of reality in it in terms of things that we're going to have to develop. We're going to have to figure out how to fund this thing. Do we get some of it from the federal government? Do we sell memberships? How do you go about raising, and the kind of number they talk about is $40 million. Well, Dollywood just announced she's going to do a $5 million rebuild of one part of her theme park. So $40 million may be actually on the conservative side. So what is this $40 million going to buy? Like I say, our concept is modeled heavily after the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. We're going to have part animal habitat with probably repatriated, rehabilitated animals. Certainly we would have a botanical garden and arboretum with a lot of things by way of museum exhibit. I think we can do a lot of things with high technology in terms of computer visualization and stuff that will make us as exciting as anything you're going to see anywhere else, even in Disney World or what's Universal, that theme park as well. For example, we can do things in terms of building our exhibits underneath a trout stream or underneath burrowing animals and actually bring that kind of thing into play. The other thing that we think could be a signature for our activity would be an aerial walkway through the tops of the trees. There is a whole other world that we never see 50 to 100 feet above ground. And in fact, there's a group from central Missouri that actually rappel up and down the huge trees in the Smokies collecting lichens and insects and so forth. The birds stratify on the basis of height in the canopy. They're birds we hear but never see because they're 75 feet in the air and you can't see them for the leaves. In the tropics, I've ridden on a crane, the gantry crane that they use in construction sites, in a gondola where the operator would raise us up and run us out and drop us down into the canopy at a particular place, and you could sample and so forth. It was interesting. In that situation, there were iron doors around the canopy and the cupola, and the guy said, if you even hear a bee buzzing, slam those doors because you have killer bees down there that are up in the tops of those canopies. Same thing on the Olympic Peninsula has been done. And if you've ever been on a stationary tower with the wind blowing and the trees going back and forth, it would probably be as exciting as the Thunderhead roller coaster. You might have to take Dramamine before you did it. So there are things that you can do. We can do things with the nighttime vision. We can do things with virtual reality. I don't know, you guys may not have had biology to the point where you've actually looked through a microscope at some of the critters, the very small critters that live in soil, like nematodes. If you blow those things up and look at them, they are the most ferocious, out-of-this-world, horrible big mouthpieces and sucking parts. I mean, there's a war going on there. And, you could put yourself into that from a computer in a virtual reality kind of point of view and begin to feel like what the struggle is in that kind of an environment. Then you come out on the other side and there could be some educational things. There's just lots of potential to do interesting things with night vision and microscopy and so forth. So what is this? Now it's getting a little brighter. We're looking at something that's going to be 100 to 200 acres in size, not a small piece of land. And it would represent the major types of forests that you find in the Smokies: hemlock, northern hardwood, spruce fir at the kind of the higher elevations, the cove hardwood that you see in the valleys with the yellow poplar and red maples and so forth, the pine oak that you see over around Cates Cove, where you have pine forest and oak forest predominantly because it's a southern exposure, shallow soils, very dry. But it goes beyond that. If you've ever been to the Sonoran Desert Museum, they have an aviary out there, and we have one real species of hummingbird, the ruby-throated. And every now and then a rufous gets confused and goes east-west rather than north-south, and a rufous will end up over here, oftentimes over in Blount County. Out there they have about 20 different kinds of hummingbirds. And so you walk into this aviary, and the flowering plants and whatnot are there, and the next thing you know, you've got a hummingbird sitting right here in front of your eye checking you out, and another one checking you out. And, you just can't get that close to those kinds of organisms in the wild. You can maybe see them flit. And so this would go hand in hand, if you will, with the park, where you may see some things there, but you could come here and see more of them, or vice versa. A mountain stream. There are lots of things in a mountain stream there that are very interesting. The same thing with butterflies, a conservatory for butterflies, and obviously a museum building with hopefully a lot of high-tech sorts of things. Talk a minute about parking. We're probably not talking about adding to the number of visitors that come into the area, but how do you manage those visitors? And we show a landscape parking lot here, like Dollywood or whatever. But what about if you built a big old parking garage out on the interstate at the interchange, and you then had a controlled access road with hydroelectric buses that brought the people into the venue, and as they were coming through a controlled landscape, so it was pretty to look out the window, but you could also have video monitors that kind of laid out what they were going to be seeing. And you kept those cars out on the interstate as opposed to bringing them all the way into that area. And I got a feeling that if you sold that the right way, you could get federal money for that part of the project. So landscape parking is, that's today's world, but we would like to think out of the box, if you will, for something like that as well. Throughout the thing, various wildflower displays, meadows balls, pathways, places where people could go for retreats or, specialized meetings or whatever in the area. And, each habitat would try to use ways to view the wildlife as naturally as possible. Exhibits, and I've talked a little bit about some of this. I like this one, cutting-edge exhibits and large-screen cinema. And this is a picture from inside the Sugarlands Visitor Center. It's a very good display, but cutting edge, not quite. There are things you could do that would be probably more exciting and so forth that would make that exhibit even better. Gift shops and restaurants. These are not businesses that we ourselves would try to operate. We would team with, for example, the Natural History Association, which runs all the bookstores in the park, and let them operate it. They're nonprofit. They would take some of the money back into the park and some of the money to us. That's a win-win situation. By the same token, we're not going to get into the restaurant business. We want to focus on the Discover Life Center and not these ancillary enterprises, but you need those, and they can be significant profit centers. And then, of course, places where we can reach out and really get hold of the educational component with children. A lot of things we've talked about. You could take an interactive computer hike. Before you went to the chimneys, you could pretty much walk the path vis-a-vis computer and see what you're going to see, or have things pointed out that as you walked, you could then begin to pay special attention to. One of the things, and this is actually done in the Baltimore Science Center, would be make the scientists that are doing their research there a part of the museum, so that in one place you had a laboratory workroom area, and the scientists are in there doing their stick, and the public is, in a sense, walking around them and looking at what they're doing, and periodically a docent or somebody would come out and talk to the assembled group about what's going on. This is done at the Baltimore Science Center there in the Inner Harbor. Lots of things where volunteers could lead wildflower hikes and other kind of things. The wildflower pilgrimage in the park attracts about 1,500 visitors that weekend, so there's a lot of interest in the natural biota in that springtime flora. We could do things about showing people how they could capture some of that diversity in their own backyard with birdhouses and various kinds of plantings that attract wildlife. And here would be an entirely new kind of business for the area, ecotourism. It's big in the tropics. It could also be big in the Appalachians. So if you look at our model again, the Sonoran Desert Museum has 500,000 visitors annually. Knoxville Zoo has 477, to put that in perspective. The one thing that the zoo has, and I'm not sure what the membership is at the Knoxville Zoo, but many people that go there will join up. They're so moved that they'll pay $25 to receive their newsletter. And then every year, they get this beautiful 3 or 4 times a year flyer on what's happening at the museum. And about December, they get join again. And so they maintain a membership of about 23,000 with a budget, an annual operating budget of about $7.5 million and actual employment of 150 people. And for anybody that goes into the Tucson tourism department asking for things to see, they get pointed in that direction. So compared to that, 500,000 visitors a year, we're within a day's drive of half the U.S. population. We've probably got greater habitat and species diversity. We're going to have more, we probably have now and will have more detailed knowledge of the biota that are there. You've got the recognition of the Smokies, and reasonably, we would estimate potential for 2 million visitors a year. The downside of that is you've got to build the infrastructure to support that, and that adds significant, as you know, as engineers, that's going to add significantly to your capitalization. But you grow to that. The Ripley's Aquarium opened the first year out of the box, 1.7 million visitors, and they're up now around 2 million. Dollywood had 2.2 million this year, and this was a down year. So with the 10 million people that are coming into this area that click the rubber hoses on the roads, there's a tremendous potential here that really the Desert Museum doesn't have. So we see, and I'm not going to try and read all this because this is really to get the Chambers of Commerce's attention, but we see with something like this that we're going to add, both to the economy, to the educational opportunities, public education of the value of the biota that are here, and in a way that will be very attractive. We've already been approached by Biltmore to do, if we become a reality, they want to do advertising with us. And that's the first time they've ever reached out to something in that Gatlinburg area. So they see it as something of a quality that they would find attractive. This is just a shot on the western edge of Cades Cove where they've done a lot of burning and are bringing back native grasses. That used to be fescue with cattle. Now it's native grasses. And these are the guys that we've overlooked as we've walked through the streams and forests, but they're the base of the food chain. And it's in this class of invertebrates and so forth where most of the unknown diversity lies. But again, it's important that we understand that. Everybody's going to benefit. The park benefits. I think the local communities can benefit. The residents like it because it's something that they feel they may have a chance to control. They don't control Ripley's, they don't control Dollywood. Those are corporate kind of things. But something like this, they feel like they could control. So, keep your eyes on the newspaper. Hopefully over the next period of time, and I can't tell you what that period of time will be, we'll continue to do the planning toward, a world-renowned center that can focus on good stewardship, bring more science opportunities and so forth to the area, and create this that would really be something that would be a national treasure, not just a local treasure. So imagine this now as not just a concept, but something that actually sits on the landscape that we can all visit, become volunteers with, etc., and reap the benefits from. Again, I really appreciate your all attention and opportunity to come tell you about. This is a project that I don't care how tired I am at night, and when I was out at the lab, that was a killer kind of job. I could come from the lab and give this talk to a group, and when I left the group, I was okay again. I mean, it's just that kind of thing. It's an idea that won't die. You say, well, I've got this crazy idea about a discovery center in the park or adjacent to the park. And, yeah, everybody says, oh, that's great. Have you thought about doing this? So it's not a single person's idea. Everybody that's come into this thing has added something to it. And I think it'll continue that way. And I think that's the thing that gives it that robustness. So thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions and comments. Barry?
Yeah, have you got your eyes on any spots yet?
Question is, have we gotten our eyes on any spots? As part of this feasibility study, we had probably about 4 landowners who had given us permission to go onto their land and look at it in this context. And some of the land, there's a lot of interest to do something up to Highway 321 north towards Cosby and up towards Pittman Center because they're widening that highway, and you wouldn't like to see that develop like Pigeon Forge has developed. So there's some interest there, and there's actually land that is between 321 and the park that would be available so that this thing could back right up against the park. So yes, people have, and I was surprised that they would be that forthcoming at this stage, but they have been.
I have a question before you think of other questions and comments. I didn't, in your presentation, I didn't see where you have a website or where if you want to participate in this activity by giving money. I didn't see, how do you do that? Do you have a website?
We don't have a website yet. What we've done thus far is just really based on volunteer effort, and I think the next stage that we've got to cross over is to get enough financial backing to hire a part-time executive director or somebody that can take care of things like websites and begin to make. We have not even filed yet for a 501c3 status.
We have students that probably do that for you,
Mm-hmm.
at least initially. Do we have other questions or comments? Jimmy?
Yeah, the question is, what help are we getting from local conservation environmental organizations? The ATBI has basically been funded to this point by the Friends of the Smokies and the Natural History Association through the park. And our budget on the ATBI is about $250,000 a year. So the help has been, from that standpoint, modest in the total project terms, but actually, when you consider the budgets involved, I think very generous. The Discover Center itself as we get out to groups, we're getting a lot of people that say, well, where do I sign up? And if you're so inclined, my email here at UT is wharris4@utk.edu. We have had, as I said, support from local governments to get this matching grant, and we've had some modest support from the Gatlinburg Gateway Foundation. But in terms of getting foursquare into the conservation groups like TCWP and so forth, we haven't done that yet.
Have you proposed this to the Department of Interior?
Have we proposed this to the Department of Interior? Yes. In fact, again, through the and the park is 100% behind this kind of a center, but we want it outside of the park, so that kind of puts us in a different ballpark. But the Department of Interior, through the Park Service, has basically funded the research to completely do all the vertebrates. And when I say do all the vertebrates, what we're trying to do is for each species develop a web page and a distribution map and so forth. So that's been funded by the park. They've also given us research grants to really study how you go about this kind of a sampling design. The sampling here is actually kind of tricky in terms of how you go about to make sure you've adequately sampled such a complex habitat. So we've had that kind of support. In this year's Senate appropriations bill for the park, there is a $500,000 plus up for the ATBI and the Smokies. And the question is, and there's wiggle room on the House side, although the ATBI is not specifically mentioned. The downside of all that is I doubt if we're going to have an interior appropriations bill. I think it's all going to roll into a big omnibus bill. So that knocks us out there. But we know who put it in on the Senate side, and it was Kristen Alexander. So if they've done it once, we can get them to do it again in a more favorable time. So 06 is going to be...
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
How do you see the interaction with faith-based groups develop? There's actually been some conflict with faith-based groups, say out of Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Of course, they were interacting specifically with the park, and so we wouldn't have that federal axe hanging over our heads. What we have found thus far, for example, if you go back into the Cherokee, go back that far, they had a spiritual relationship, if you will, with their environment. So I could see exhibits that would try to capture that, and just from an educational point of view, that sort of thing. What we have, in talking with churches, the kind of thing that has been of interest to them have been places where they can have retreats and so forth. Now, we're not going to get into the dormitory business, but we could have, meeting rooms that are very conducive to those kinds of retreats, and then with a food service, we could handle that. That's been the extent of the discussion thus far. And like I say, this was a condition of the EDA grant, and we've met that condition. As it develops, how much I'm not sure how much would actually in the ultimate. See, I think there are ways you could go into a nonprofit bond market and float bond issues and other kinds of ways to fund this, still as a not-for-profit, and adhering to all your principles without getting tied up in any particular religious ideology. But I think if you look at man's connection to environment, it's appropriate to recognize that's really been part of practically every religion. So I mean, I don't have a particular point of view.
Let me ask you. You mentioned church and synagogue mosque type groups. but those I call sectarian. It would also have to be open to non-sectarian groups, okay, that don't have anything to do with religion or whatever. Anybody that has a justifiable desire to go and spend time in nature.
Oh, yeah, no, but I was talking about facilities,
Yes.
things we would have specifically. I think that was the nature of the question.
Those
And-
facilities have to be open to non-sectarian groups. They
Yeah.
have to be.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Well, it seems like every week we have some new faces in the audience, and we're always glad to see those new faces, and you're welcome anytime. And those new people probably do not realize that we have a reception downstairs with food, and everyone is invited to attend. But before we adjourn for the reception, let's express our appreciation again to Dr. Harris for his presentation. Thank you. Mark, take the mic over there.